Hello, friends. About a week ago, I posted on my community tab, which is a place where I can post directly to people who are subscribed to me, so you should definitely subscribe to me, that I was going to be doing a cover review. And I got some submissions, which is really cool. And I want to talk about them here today because the first thing that somebody encounters when they first see your book is your cover. And as much as we say don't judge a book by its cover, the fact of the matter is we all do. Even if no books had anything interesting on the cover, they were just those blank cloth covers, we would still be judging them based on the shade, based on the size, based on how thick it was. Even if we had nothing else, we would still look at the book and decide, I don't really like that shade of mint green. I am not going to buy this book. As an aside, if you ever try to sell me a book with a mint green cover, absolutely not. I will not buy it, just on principle alone. But let's get right into this. I want to look at these covers and I want to talk a little bit about what the covers are suggesting. Now, this is a very important caveat. There is such a thing as a bad cover. A bad cover is a cover that does not reflect the professionalism of the book and doesn't match the content of the book. That's what makes a bad cover. You can have a cover that is hand-drawn or painted. You can have a cover that is made through digital art. You can have a cover that is photoshopped together from a bunch of disparate things. It doesn't matter as long as it clearly reflects the professionalism of the book and clearly communicates what someone should expect from the story. And so that's the criteria that we're going to be using to judge whether these covers are good or not. However, we will also be talking about world building because that's what a cover is doing. It is world building before somebody even opens up your book. It is telling them what they should be expecting about the world, not just the story. And that's very important. So with these criteria in mind, let's go ahead and jump into this. Our first cover is a submission by Ayush Gupta, or AG Boy, as he's known in the comments. And thank you very much for the submission. It's really cool to see people who are actively building stuff, actively writing during the writing sprints, starting to put their books together. Now, this cover did come with a caveat. This is AI-generated art, which is a problem. And it's not just a problem because I think that covers should be made by people. There are plenty of great artists who are not that expensive, and we should absolutely be using them. Even if you can't afford a piece of custom art that costs thousands of dollars for your cover, I don't think that AI-generated art is the way to go. Now, to his credit, AG Boy did make it clear that this was for the sake of generating ideas with the intent of taking this to an artist to produce the final cover. And I understand why somebody would take that route. I'm gonna maybe recommend against it for reasons I'll talk about in a second. But first, let's go ahead and take a look at the cover itself. So the first thing we have is a big sword that's kind of weird, which we'll talk about, but clearly communicates the title of the book, right? So the title is, I'm assuming, The Blade, and the series is Mystic Knights. So depending on the genre that you're writing in, you're going to want either the title or the series name to be larger. If you're writing in like lit RPG or in a lot of fantasy, then often the series name should be larger than the title, especially if you're using any other community site to promote your content. And that's because that's just how people understand books to work. Now, if you're taking this out for TradPub, then this is a very big no-no. You need the title to be the biggest thing. But let's talk about the cover itself. If you encounter this cover, a couple things are going to stand out. The first is a really important question. Why is the handle so much longer than the blade? Now, AI might have something to do with that. And so when this cover is actually taken as inspiration and turned over to an artist, that might be adjusted. The name of the book is not The Handle, and so it immediately stands out because the handle is like literally longer than the blade itself. But let's use our two criteria. Does this reflect the quality of the writing inside? I would say that if I looked at this at first blush, I would be a little bit suspect. However, the reason I would be suspect is actually not the art itself. It looks very generic, which isn't necessarily a bad thing if I'm trying to write mainstream fantasy. The issue is actually with the lettering. The entire image is quite flat, and so it doesn't look like there's a lot of depth, though some effort has been made to introduce depth through the fading trees in the background. So when I first saw this, I thought, okay, this is the kind of thing that I would find on a web novel site, which is totally fine. Like, there isn't anything wrong with that. But if you're planning on taking a book from that state out to a generalized audience, let's say through Amazon, then this is not what you want to end up with as a cover. It really does look like a lot of other self-published covers that you're going to see on Amazon. And we don't want to do that. We want to stand out from those. Now let's switch into world building. What does this cover tell me as a reader about this world? First, it does tell me that there is fighting. Obviously, if there's a sword involved, there's going to be combat. And that's pretty cool. But more importantly, the coloring of it tells me that there's also going to be magic. Clearly, this is a special blade. This is something unique. And that's kind of exciting. But there's also a bit of a polarizing thing happening here. Because not only do I have this glowing purple blade, but I have a dark forest behind it. So looking at this cover, I'm immediately going to think this is a grim or a dark story. And I'm not saying that it is grim dark, which is a specific niche thing. I'm just saying that the overall air has something sinister about it. Using the color purple, using it with a blade, using it in a dark forest. All of those have a bit of an edgy vibe. And again, not a bad thing, if that's what the story is. Now, I don't actually know what the story is, and so it's hard for me to say yes or no, did it accurately represent the story. I would suggest that, first of all, we not use AI art. And the reason is actually because using AI art will often stick an image in our head that it becomes really hard to walk away from. If this is a story not about the sword itself, but about the person wielding its sword, I would much rather see that person wielding the sword. And there's a million ways you can do that. You can have them reaching for it. You can have them holding it in their hand as they're about to strike. You can have them leaping through the air. You can have them waving it toward the sky. There's a million things that you can do. And actually, we'll start to see that as we go through the next couple of covers. So while I think that this is a good start, I think that using AI art to generate ideas can actually be a crippling thing because it becomes very restrictive. The second thing I would recommend is that the font be made a little bit more three-dimensional, so it's not quite so flat. That can be done with adding shadows to it. That can be done in a whole bunch of different ways, but you want to make sure that the fonts sort of stand out and don't blend into everything. As sort of a prototype cover to give some ideas, I don't think this is bad, and as long as the story sort of holds that dark, edgy vibe, I think it's serviceable. And again, I think it's perfectly fine if you're going to be slapping this up on Royal Road and posting your story there. Great. I just don't know that I would recommend taking this, or even a concept derived from it, out to Amazon. I will put a link in the comments, actually, to a cover designer who I used for a bunch of my books, who's on Fiverr, does fantastic work. There are a ton of people on Fiverr who can do great covers really, really cheap. And I think they're definitely worth looking into. All right, let's jump over to our next cover. So this was a recommendation. Somebody asked that we take a look at Ashes of the Sun by Django Wexler. Okay, first of all, this cover is pretty cool, but the font is way too big. This art is way too interesting to have covered up so much. So at first blush, if I picked up this book, it would immediately annoy me. Sometimes, you see things and you just go, ooh, why'd they make that decision? And for me, this cover is sort of that case. The art here is so fascinating. The longer you look at it, the more you find. The world building is really good. The colors, fantastic. The story that it tells is just really solid. And, as I talked about previously, the text pops out nicely from the back of the image. I just wish it wasn't so big. Additionally, it says Ashes of the Sun, and they've completely missed the opportunity to move that a little bit smaller and then have more of the sun shining down on the main character, who I presume that is, in the very middle. But let's talk about our two criteria. How does this reflect on the professionalism of the writing? If I picked up this book, I would assume that this is a professionally written, professionally edited, professionally published book. Just right out of the gate. I would assume, okay, this is a book that I could pick up off of a shelf at Barnes & Noble or a local bookstore, and this is what it would look like. So right out of the gate, I think the professionalism is 100% there. But what about the world building? What does it communicate to me? It communicates a sense of adventure, a sense of exploration, a sense of defiance of destruction. Here you have this crumbling hand extended into the sky. Down below, under the name, you can see a sort of tortured face staring up in despair. And then on top of that thumb, you have the main character or a character defiantly holding their sword, staring into the distance. This is a really nice juxtaposition between destruction and defiance of that destruction. And so it tells me a lot about the world. It tells me there was a once great civilization, now in ruins. It tells me that there are still people who have not just rolled over and died. But it tells me more than that. It tells me that nature is thriving. It tells me that whether humanity is or not, the world still exists. It's still there. We can see the green, we can see the water. All of those elements are communicating to me as a reader that this is a story ultimately about life. It might be hard, it might be difficult, but it is a story about life. It is a story about hope. Now, whether or not those are the actual themes of the book, I don't know. I haven't read it. Though the cover's pretty cool, so maybe I will if I can get over the fact that they made the text so big. But the fact of the matter is that it meets both of our criteria very well and communicates the professional quality of the writing, and it tells me a lot about the world. And not only does it tell me about the world, but it gets me excited about the world. Now, obviously, this is for an already published book. So there isn't really anything that I can recommend that can be changed, but that's fine. I'm sure they're not going to go back and change the font for me. But I think this cover's really good. I do have a little bit of an issue with the name of the author being as big as the title. That's just a personal preference thing. And speaking of personal preference, let's jump over to our third cover. This is the last one we're going to look at, and it just so happens to be a book of mine. So Iron Tyrant is a series that is going to be coming out very soon. Actually, at the end of October. October 29th is the release date for book 1. It's called Chain of Feathers, and I'm super excited to bring it to you. But I wanted to use this cover as one of the ones that I examined because I think that it's important to recognize how a difference in genre requires different types of covers. So this is for a lit RPG fantasy. Ashes of the Sun was for more general fantasy. And there are a couple of conventions that people use in lit RPG that I think are worth pointing out. You'll notice that Iron Tyrant is the biggest text on the cover. And that's because that's the series name. People who read lit RPG typically don't name the books individually. And so it's Dungeon Crawler Carl Book 1, Dungeon Crawler Carl Book 2, Dungeon Crawler Carl Book 3, and so on and so forth. Even though every single one of those books has a different name. And I discovered something really fascinating because I wrote a series. It's called the Tower series. It's a continuation after the Titan series. And people don't call it the Tower series. They call it Forge Master, which is the name of the first book. And so once I realized that there is actually, in this genre, there's a convention where people just use the name of the series as a stand-in for the title, I started shifting how I set up my books. So I still have a name for this book, and I will still have names for pretty much all of my books. The series title becomes the most important thing. So Iron Tyrant. Now, let's examine this book using the criteria that I set out to begin with. First, How does this reflect on the professionalism of the writing? I think that this reflects well on the professionalism of the writing. However, it doesn't communicate trad novel. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because I want to communicate exactly what my story is to readers. And so when someone sees this, the art is fantastic. Like, it's such a good piece of art. But unlike most traditional novels, this is designed to be seen on a screen. It's not designed to be seen on the front cover of a paperback or a hardback book. And to that end, we want the art to be the primary focus. And so we try to include as much of the character as possible. We try to shrink the text down so it's much smaller. And the reason is because anytime somebody sees this cover, they're also going to be seeing text accompanying it. And that text that accompanies it will be telling them what this is. That's not how a book works, though, when it's on a shelf. When you pick up a book off the shelf, you have to include all of the relevant information right on the cover. And so it necessitates the text being larger. I know I just made fun of Ashes of the Sun for having text that was too large. But that's because I come from this convention, where the primary focus has to be the cool thing that's happening on the cover. But given the quality of the art, I think it's safe to say that somebody picking it up off of a shelf or somebody looking at it on Amazon, which is primarily where they're going to be buying it from, will think to themselves, this is going to be a high quality product. And they'll think that because of the quality of the art. Again, as much as we say you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, everybody judges all the books by their covers. So what about world building? Well, looking at this image, there are a couple of things that you can spot immediately. First of all, we're in a fantasy setting. The dude's got armor, he's got buckles, he's got, sort of standard fantasy adventurer dress. The second thing is you can see the birds. There are a whole bunch of them. But most important is the bird he's holding in his hand and the paper that he's removing from it. Immediately, you start to understand that, this has something to do with messages, something to do with information, something to do maybe with spies. It starts to build the feeling. When you combine that with the light, where you have beams of light coming through the window, but then the darkened stone background, you start to get a sense of what the world feels like. One of the things I love about this picture is just how many different kinds of textures there are. I think it's absolutely fantastic. Now, obviously, I'm not going to put out a cover that I don't like or I don't think is good. This one happens to be one of my absolute favorites, and I'm so excited for people to get their hands on this book. But I'm really curious about your thoughts. Of the covers that I've shown you, which ones did you like, which ones did you not like? And more importantly, what do these covers communicate to you? Because ultimately, that's what matters, right? When we look at a book, we have perceptions about it. And so, what are yours? I'm really curious to know if they match up with mine or if you completely disagree. Either way, let me know down in the comments, and I'll see you later.